Not everyone who cares about you wants what's best for you. Some just want you predictable, accessible, and emotionally manageable. Control rarely announces itself as domination. It doesn't arrive loudly or violently. It arrives wrapped in concern, framed as care, and justified as closeness. It looks like someone who just wants what's best for you, someone who worries, checks in constantly, offers advice you didn't ask for, and reacts emotionally when you don't follow it. Because it feels warm, familiar, and personal, most people never recognize it or control at all. Affection becomes dangerous when it is conditional on predictability, when love, approval, or attention subtly depend on you remaining emotionally accessible, consistent, and easy to influence. The relationship is no longer built on mutual recognition. It is built on regulation. One nervous system quietly managing another. This kind of control often develops unconsciously. People learn early that closeness is maintained through influence. They discover that if they worry enough, help enough, advise enough, or stay involved enough, they can reduce their own anxiety. Your choices, your moods, your direction in life become stabilizing factors for them. Over time, your autonomy feels threatening. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are doing something independently. The controlling person rarely experiences themselves as controlling. They experience themselves as invested. They tell themselves they care more than others do. They interpret your resistance as distance, your independence as rejection, and your boundaries as emotional withdrawal. In their internal narrative, you are changing, becoming cold, becoming selfish, becoming different. What they don't see is that the discomfort they feel is the loss of influence over your inner world. Affection used as control often relies on emotional rewards and punishments rather than direct commands. Approval when you comply, withdrawal when you don't, warmth when you remain aligned, tension when you diverge. Nothing is said openly, but everything is felt. The body learns quickly. You begin to anticipate reactions, manage expectations, soften your truth, and adjust your behavior to preserve harmony. Over time, this feels like love, because love is what you receive when you self-regulate in the right way. This dynamic becomes especially powerful when you are empathetic, reflective, or conflict-averse. You notice shifts in mood. You sense disappointment before it is spoken. You feel responsible for emotional balance. Control does not need force when sensitivity does the work for it. The more aware you are of others, the easier it is to shape you through subtle emotional cues. The illusion of affection collapses the moment you begin to change internally. When your decisions no longer require external validation. When your sense of direction comes from within rather than from feedback. When you stop explaining yourself excessively. Suddenly, the warmth changes. Concern turns into criticism. Support turns into suspicion. Care turns into commentary. The same behaviors that once felt loving now feel invasive. At this point, many people make a critical mistake. They try to restore closeness by shrinking. They explain more, reassure more, compromise more. They mistake the tension as a misunderstanding rather than a structural shift. But the issue is not communication. It is control losing its grip. No amount of reassurance can replace the influence that has disappeared. What makes this form of control so difficult to confront is that it coexists with genuine care. Someone can truly love you and still depend on managing you to feel safe. Someone can want your happiness and still need your compliance. These contradictions live comfortably in the unconscious. Exposing them threatens the identity of being a good person, which is why resistance often intensifies when you name the dynamic. Control disguise. As affection does not survive awareness. Once you see it, your body reacts differently. Guilt loses its persuasive power. Emotional pressure becomes visible. You begin to feel the difference between connection and compliance. This is when relationships either renegotiate or deteriorate. Some people adapt, learning to relate without influence. Others escalate their attempts, becoming more emotional, more involved, more reactive. The shift is subtle but irreversible. You stop asking, how do I keep them comfortable? And start asking, why does my autonomy feel like a threat here? You realize that affection, which requires you to remain small, dependent, or emotionally available on demand, is not intimacy, but management. At the moment you stop confusing care with control, you begin to reclaim parts of yourself that were never meant to be negotiated, parts that were quietly handed over in exchange for approval, safety, and belonging, parts that now want to return to you as you learn to recognize when love feels calming versus when it feels constricting, when closeness expands you versus when it subtly trains you to remain who you used to be rather than who you are becoming. Every relationship contains an unspoken agreement about who you're allowed to be, and most conflict begins when you break it without warning. Every relationship begins with an agreement that is never spoken. Long before boundaries are defined or expectations are clarified, psychics quietly negotiate who each person will be allowed to be. This negotiation happens through tone, reaction, repetition, and reward. What is encouraged stays. What is resisted disappears. Over time, a stable pattern forms, and that pattern becomes the relationship. This is the unconscious contract. It determines how much space you are permitted to take, how much emotion you are allowed to express, and how far you can move from the original version of yourself without consequence. Most people mistake this contract for chemistry or compatibility. In reality, it is a psychological arrangement designed to reduce uncertainty and maintain equilibrium between two nervous systems. The contract forms quickly. Early interactions teach both sides what creates approval and what creates tension. If humor is rewarded, humor becomes your role. If emotional availability creates closeness, availability becomes expected. If self-doubt makes others feel needed, confidence becomes risky. Nothing is stated outright, yet everything is learned. You begin to show up in a way that works. What makes the unconscious contract powerful is that it benefits both parties, at least initially. One person receives stability, validation, or emotional regulation. The other receives belonging, safety, or approval. The exchange feels mutual, which is why it rarely feels manipulative. It feels like connection. The danger is not in the existence of the contract, but in forgetting that it exists at all. Problems emerge when growth disrupts the terms. Change does not register as neutral. It registers as violation. When you expand beyond the role you originally occupied, the other person experiences uncertainty. Their expectations no longer match your behavior. Their emotional predictions fail. The system destabilizes. Rather than recognizing this as a need to renegotiate, the psyche interprets it as betrayal. This is why phrases like "you've changed" carry emotional weight. They are not observations. They are protests. They signal that the original agreement is no longer being honored. The discomfort is not about morality or loyalty. It is about loss of structure. You are no longer fulfilling the function that made the relationship feel secure. The unconscious contract explains why resistance often appears precisely when growth becomes authentic. Early self-improvement may be celebrated because it does not threaten the dynamic. It enhances your role without altering it. But when growth reaches the level of autonomy, when decisions stop being negotiated, when validation is no longer required, the contract begins to collapse. At that point, the relationship enters a crisis. One of three things happens. The contract is renegotiated consciously. The relationship restructures around new roles, or control mechanisms emerge to restore the old pattern. Guilt, criticism, emotional withdrawal, and subtle punishment are common tools, not because the other person is cruel, but because the psyche resists losing a stabilizing arrangement. What makes this especially difficult is that the contract was never explicit. You cannot point to a conversation where the rules were agreed upon. This creates confusion and self-doubt. You may feel responsible for upsetting something you cannot name. You may over-explain your changes, hoping clarity will restore harmony. But explanation does not repair a broken contract. Only renegotiation does. Many people avoid growth precisely because they sense this cost. They intuitively know that becoming more whole will disrupt the relational order. Remaining fragmented keeps peace. Remaining predictable keeps belonging. The unconscious contract quietly rewards self-limitation, and over time, the price of belonging becomes invisibly high. Breaking the contract does not make you disloyal. It makes you conscious. Awareness reveals that some connections were sustained not by mutual recognition, but by mutual avoidance. You avoided your expansion. The other avoided their adaptation. The contract worked because neither side challenged it. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. You begin to recognize which relationships allow renegotiation and which require stagnation. You notice where closeness depends on compliance and where difference is tolerated. You realize that some bonds were never meant to survive individuation because their stability depended on you remaining a version of yourself that no longer exists. The unconscious contract dissolves not through confrontation, but through consistency. You continue to act from internal alignment rather than external expectation. You allow others to feel their reactions without managing them. You stop apologizing for change. Over time, the system either reorganizes or collapses. Both outcomes carry loss, but only one allows integrity. This is the hidden tension beneath many relational breakdowns. Not betrayal of love, but betrayal of arrangement. Not abandonment of people, but abandonment of roles. Growth feels disruptive because it exposes agreements that were never meant to be permanent. Agreements formed in unconsciousness, sustained through familiarity, and threaten the moment one person becomes unwilling to remain the same in order to preserve a dynamic that only functioned when neither side questioned the cost of staying exactly as they were the moment. You stop needing approval. Something dangerous happens. The people who relied on your compliance start feeling exposed. Individuation is often described as a personal journey, a quiet process of becoming more whole, more integrated, more aligned with one's inner truth. What is rarely acknowledged is that this process does not occur in isolation. Individuation happens inside relational systems, and every system reacts when one of its members begins to reorganize from the inside. From the outside, individuation can look subtle. A person becomes less reactive. They pause before responding. They make decisions without excessive explanation. They tolerate disapproval without collapsing. These changes appear small, but psychologically they are profound because they signal a shift in where authority resides. The individual is no longer governed primarily by external feedback, but by an internal compass. This shift is not neutral to others. Most relationships are organized around mutual regulation. People soothe each other, affirm each other, and unconsciously keep one another within familiar emotional ranges. When one person individuates, they withdraw from this system of mutual adjustment. They no longer respond automatically. They no longer absorb tension to keep peace. They no longer shape themselves to fit expectations. The system loses a regulating function, and instability follows. Individuation threatens predictability. Predictability creates safety. When someone becomes internally guided, their behavior is no longer easily anticipated. Their yes is no longer guaranteed. Their presence no longer depends on approval. For those who rely on external stability to feel secure, this unpredictability is experienced as danger rather than growth. The threat is not logical. It is nervous system based. A person who individuates stops mirroring the emotional state of others. They stop reinforcing shared beliefs without examination. They stop participating in familiar dramas. To an unconscious psyche, this feels like withdrawal of connection, even when no distance is intended. The bond feels weakened because the old signals are gone. This is why individuation is often misinterpreted. It is labeled as arrogance, coldness, or emotional unavailability. The individuating person is accused of thinking they are better, being selfish, or abandoning the group. These accusations are projections. They translate internal discomfort into moral language. It is easier to criticize change than to tolerate uncertainty. Individuation also exposes dependency. When one person stops over-functioning, the imbalance becomes visible. The emotional labor that once went unnoticed is suddenly absent. Others must confront their own unregulated states, unmet needs, or suppressed autonomy. Rather than adapting, many attempt to pull the individuating person back into the old role. Pressure intensifies. Advice becomes insistence. Concern becomes surveillance. Love becomes conditional. The system attempts to restore equilibrium by reasserting influence. The individuating person feels this as resistance, but from the system's perspective, it is self-preservation. This is the paradox of individuation. The healthier a person becomes internally, the more destabilizing they can be externally. Growth removes the glue that held certain dynamics together. What once felt like closeness reveals itself as entanglement. What felt like loyalty reveals itself as dependence. Individuation does not destroy relationships by itself. It tests them. Relationships capable of adaptation shift from fusion to connection. They allow difference without punishment. They survive the loss of control. Relationships built on role fixation and emotional dependency fracture under the strain. The individuating person often feels guilt during this process. They sense the discomfort they cause. They notice withdrawal, tension, or subtle hostility. The temptation is to soften the process, to reassure excessively, to dilute authenticity, to protect others from distress. This compromises individuation at its core. An internal authority that must constantly negotiate its legitimacy is not yet authority. True individuation requires tolerating misunderstanding. It requires allowing others to feel destabilized without rushing to stabilize them. This does not mean becoming cruel or dismissive. It means refusing to regress in order to maintain emotional comfort for others. It means accepting that growth changes the relational field, whether one intends it or not. Over time, the system recalibrates. Some relationships reorganize around mutual autonomy. Others fade as their function dissolves. The loss can feel personal, but it is structural. What is being mourned is not intimacy, but familiarity. Not love, but predictability. Individuation becomes threatening only to systems that require sameness to survive. To those invested in control, compliance, or emotional fusion, internal authority looks like rebellion. But individuation is not an attack. It is a reorientation of responsibility, a refusal to remain externally governed, a movement toward psychological adulthood that inevitably alters every bond it touches. Because when one person stops living as a reflection of others and begins living as centered self, the entire relational landscape must adjust to the presence of someone who can no longer be easily influenced, managed, or pulled back into patterns that once felt safe precisely because no one questioned when. People lose control over you. They don't call it fear. They call it your arrogance, your coldness, or your so-called change. Projection is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in human relationships. It is rarely recognized in the moment because it operates beneath conscious awareness, yet its effects are palpable, often devastating. What projection does is deceptively simple. It takes unacknowledged feelings, fears, or desires and assigns them to another person. The result is a distortion of perception. The other person is no longer seen for who they are, but for what the projector cannot own within themselves. Hostility often arises hand in hand with projection, not because the person being projected upon is inherently threatening, but because they have become a mirror for what the other refuses to face. The discomfort of seeing their own suppressed impulses, insecurities, or unfulfilled desires triggers a defensive reaction. To protect the self-image, the mind externalizes these feelings, labeling them as traits or intentions of someone else. The target of projection feels unjustly criticized, attacked, or misunderstood, while the projector feels justified in their judgment or anger. Projection disguises itself as judgment, accusation, or moral superiority. It is often paired with a tone of righteousness. A person may claim someone else is selfish, controlling, or arrogant, while in truth they are grappling with their own versions of these qualities. The hostility that emerges is a misfired attempt at self-preservation. By attributing the uncomfortable trait to another, they avoid confronting their own inner conflict. The energy that could have gone towards self-reflection is redirected outward, creating tension, misunderstanding, and conflict. Relationships are particularly vulnerable to projection when boundaries are weak or emotional entanglement is high. The more invested someone is in another's compliance or predictability, the more likely they are to project their unmet needs, frustrations, or insecurities onto that person. Subtle shifts in behavior, autonomy, or decision-making can trigger disproportionate reaction. Because the external change exposes an internal discomfort that has been carefully avoided. The reaction may manifest as passive aggression, criticism, or overt hostility, all aimed at regaining a sense of equilibrium that is, in reality, lost inside the projector. Projection is not always conscious, which makes it especially insidious. People rarely intend harm. They are acting from patterns established by unexamined feelings. A person may genuinely believe they are helping, protecting, or guiding, when in fact they are enforcing their own unresolved psychological needs. Hostility emerges when the projected qualities resist containment, when the target refuses to conform to the expectations imposed upon them, or when they mirror back a truth the projector cannot bear. Awareness of projection is rare but transformative. Once recognized, it becomes clear that hostility is often less about person targeted and more about the internal state of the projector. What feels like betrayal, criticism, or attack is frequently a reflection of fears, inadequacies, or suppressed impulses being externalized. The challenge is that this reflection is involuntary. It cannot be negotiated away with reasoning or appeasement. Attempts to explain oneself, justify actions, or placate the other rarely work, because the conflict exists within the projector, not the target. Projection and hostility intersect most painfully when boundaries are porous, roles are undefined, or dependency is high. Emotional closeness without differentiation amplifies the effect. The closer someone is, the more effectively they can reflect back what has been avoided. This is why family, intimate partners, and long-term colleagues often become the arenas where projection manifests most intensely. The traits being projected are familiar to the projector yet unbearable to acknowledge, and the proximity makes the reflection unavoidable. Hostility as a byproduct of projection is also cumulative. Small, unaddressed projections accumulate over time, creating layers of resentment, tension, and misunderstanding. Each instance reinforces the false narrative: this person is difficult, ungrateful, or wrong, rather than recognizing the underlying internal dynamics driving the perception. The projected traits take on a life of their own, shaping the relational pattern. The target may respond defensively, fueling further projection and hostility, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that can feel impossible to break. The most challenging aspect of projection is that it can make the target feel responsible for another's discomfort. Even when the hostility is misdirected, the person experiencing it often internalizes the blame. This produces confusion, self-doubt, and attempts at overcompensation, which inadvertently strengthen the control the projection exerts. Efforts to fix the other rarely succeed because the problem is not external behavior, but the unacknowledged internal state being projected. Understanding projection reframes hostility. It becomes less about personal attack and more about psychological dynamics, recognizing that anger, criticism, or judgment may be displaced aspects of someone else's psyche allows for a more measured response. It illuminates patterns that previously seemed arbitrary or personal. Yet, this understanding does not make projection easy to navigate. The reactions can still feel painful, destabilizing, or threatening because the energy driving them is real and directed toward you. Ultimately, projection and hostility reveal the ways in which unresolved internal conflict shapes relationships. People do not lash out arbitrarily, they respond to their own internal dissonance, often without knowing it. They interpret autonomy, growth, or boundary setting as personal affront because those qualities illuminate what they have avoided in themselves. The hostility is not always fair, but it is consistent with the psychological mechanism at work, making it predictable in patterns. If one knows what to observe and how to trace the source back to the unacknowledged parts of the psyche, growth doesn't create enemies. It reveals who was only comfortable with you as long as you stayed small. Resistance is a natural consequence of change. It arises not because the world conspires against transformation, nor because growth is inherently wrong, but because psychological and relational systems are organized to maintain equilibrium. Any shift, internal or external, disrupts stability, and stability is the default preference of the nervous system, both individually and collectively. When a person begins to evolve, make autonomous decisions, or establish internal authority, resistance appears. It is inevitable because relationships, social structures, and even self-concepts are calibrated to expect constancy. Change, by its very nature, threatens these calibrations. The systems that once provided comfort or predictability now encounter unpredictability, and unpredictability triggers defensive reactions. Resistance is the psychological manifestation of the discomfort created by disrupted expectation. Resistance is rarely direct or overt. It often takes the form of subtle tension, passive-aggressive behavior, and emotional pressure designed to restore the prior state. A person may question your decisions, criticize your methods, or withhold validation. They may escalate involvement under the guise of concern or care. All of these behaviors are attempts, conscious or unconscious, to regain a sense of control or equilibrium that has been destabilized by your change. The dynamics of resistance are reinforced by projection. When someone is faced with change they cannot control, their own discomfort becomes externalized. They perceive you as selfish, arrogant, or reckless, even if your choices are responsible, ethical, and constructive. This projection turns internal anxiety into external opposition. The hostility may feel personal, but it is primarily a defensive response to uncertainty. Resistance is magnified in relationships built on dependency or emotional fusion. Where closeness relies on predictability, deviation is experienced as threat. Your growth signals that the relational economy, your shared roles, expectations, and emotional patterns is shifting. This shift forces others to confront their own limitations, insecurities, or unexamined assumptions. Rather than facing internal discomfort, the psyche externalizes the tension and resistance becomes directed at the agent of change rather than the internal conflict itself. Even in situations where resistance is subtle or unintentional, it is persistent. People often prefer discomfort. They understand to the uncertainty of new dynamics. They cling to habitual interactions, fixed roles, and predictable outcome because these patterns reduce cognitive and emotional strain. Change introduces unpredictability into the system, requiring adaptation, reflection, and sometimes loss. The psychological cost of adjusting to transformation makes resistance almost automatic. Resistance is not always hostile. Sometimes is expressed as confusion, doubt, or hesitation. It may appear as attempts to reason, persuade, or delay, all of which are designed to maintain the previous order. Other times it manifests as avoidance, withdrawal, or criticism. Regardless of form, the underlying principle is consistent. System resists the change that threatens its established norms. Understanding this principle shifts perspective from frustration to observation. Resistance is not a moral judgment, but a predictable reaction of a system striving to preserve its prior configuration. The inevitability of resistance extends beyond interpersonal relationships. Internal resistance occurs within the self as well. Habits, identities, and self-concepts have inertia. Growth that challenges these patterns meets psychological friction. The mind generates rationalizations, excuses, or distractions to maintain stability. The body, conditioned by routine and repetition, reacts physiologically to the threat of the unknown. Resistance within oneself mirrors resistance from others, reinforcing the perception that change is inherently difficult or contested. Recognizing the inevitability of resistance allows for strategic navigation. It requires differentiating between legitimate, adaptive tension and destructive opposition. Some forms of resistance invite reflection, dialogue, and renegotiation of relational expectations. Others serve as indicators that boundaries are being crossed or that emotional projections are influencing perception. By observing without immediate reaction, one can preserve integrity and avoid unnecessary compromise. Resistance is also a measure of significance. The more substantial the growth, the greater the perceived disruption. Minor changes provoke minor resistance. Profound transformation triggers intensified responses. This is why the development of internal authority, psychological integration, or moral alignment often coincides with heightened relational tension. The intensity of resistance is proportional to the degree of independence or authenticity being expressed. Finally, resistance is an invitation to clarity. It illuminates which systems, relationships, or patterns are adaptable and which are rigid. It exposes dependency, control dynamics, and the unspoken rules that govern behavior. While resistance may feel uncomfortable, inconvenient, or unjust, it functions as a feedback mechanism. By recognizing its inevitability, one can anticipate its manifestations, prepare for its challenges, and navigate change without losing presence, composure, or self-direction.